The church doors were still closing when the groom leaned toward the old man and said, "Loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, you couldn't even rent a suit for your own daughter's wedding?" The organ had just stopped playing. The bride was still holding her flowers. And her father, standing there in a jacket stained with engine grease he'd scrubbed at for 2 hours that morning and still hadn't gotten out, didn't say a word. He just looked down at his hands. Those hands had fixed cars for 31 years. Those hands had paid for piano lessons he couldn't afford by working Saturdays nobody asked him to work. Those hands had walked his daughter down that aisle 4 minutes ago, shaking the whole way, because this was the proudest moment of his life. And now 300 people were watching his future son-in-law humiliate him in front of God and everybody he loved. Nobody in that church knew yet that in the next 10 minutes, the wedding would stop completely. Nobody knew that the priest standing at the altar was about to do something no one in that town had ever seen a priest do. And nobody, especially not the groom, had any idea what that old mechanic in the dirty jacket was actually capable of. This story starts 3 years earlier, in a garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The old man's name was Walter. He ran a small repair shop on the edge of town, the kind of place with a bell on the door and a dog that slept behind the counter. He'd owned it since he was 26. He'd buried his wife when his daughter, Emily, was only 9, and from that day on, it had just been the 2 of them. Walter never remarried. He never really tried. He said once, to a customer who asked, that he'd already found the only woman he was ever going to love, and raising Emily right felt like enough of a second job to fill the space where a wife used to be. Emily grew up in that garage. She did her homework on the workbench. She learned to read a torque wrench before she learned to ride a bike. And when she got older, when she started dreaming about college and a life bigger than a small town with 1 stoplight, Walter never once told her to dream smaller. He just worked more hours. He skipped vacations. He drove the same truck for 18 years. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation because new clothes were money that could go toward Emily's tuition instead. She got into a good university, business school, and 4 years later she got a job at a marketing firm downtown, the kind of place with glass walls and a lobby that smelled like money. That's where she met Daniel. Daniel was handsome in the way that made people stop mid-sentence. He came from a family that owned half the commercial real estate in the city. He drove a car that cost more than Walter's shop made in 2 years. And when he looked at Emily across a conference room table during her first month on the job, something in his expression said he'd already decided she belonged to him. He was charming. He was attentive. He sent flowers to her apartment for no reason at all, and for a while that felt like romance instead of what it actually was, which was control wearing a nice suit. Emily brought him home to meet her father about 6 months into dating. Walter shook his hand, looked him dead in the eye the way he did with every customer before he trusted them with a car, and said, "You treat her right, we'll get along fine." Daniel smiled that smile of his and said, "Of course, sir." But Walter noticed something that day. Small things. The way Daniel's eyes moved across the garage, across the dented tool cabinets, and the concrete floor with the oil stains that never fully came out. The way his smile tightened just slightly when he saw the apartment above the shop where Walter still lived. The same apartment Emily grew up in. It wasn't disgust exactly. It was something quieter. Something like a man doing math in his head and not liking the number he was getting. Walter didn't say anything to Emily. He didn't want to be the father who ruined his daughter's happiness over a feeling he couldn't even explain. But he remembered it. Over the next 2 years, Daniel proposed, and Emily said yes with tears streaming down her face, and everyone around her seemed thrilled. Everyone except Walter, who smiled for her sake and kept his worry folded up quietly in his chest, the way he folded up everything he didn't want her to see. The wedding planning started, and that's when things got harder to ignore. Daniel's mother took over almost everything. The venue, the guest list, the color scheme. She was polite to Walter in the way people are polite to someone they've already decided doesn't matter, smiling at him across a table while making decisions that were never actually his to make. At one dinner, while discussing the seating chart, she asked Emily, not unkindly but not gently either, "Will your father be bringing a +1, or would he prefer to sit near the back with the staff's families?" Emily's jaw tightened. She said her father would be sitting up front. where the father of the bride belongs." Daniel's mother smiled and said nothing more, but the room felt a few degrees colder for the rest of the night. Walter wasn't there for that conversation. Emily never told him. She didn't want him to feel unwelcome at his own daughter's wedding. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice kept telling him something wasn't right about this family. About the way they measured people. About the way their kindness always seemed to come with conditions attached, like a loan he hadn't agreed to take. There was one night, about 8 months before the wedding, when Emily called her father in tears after a small argument with Daniel over something that seemed minor at the time. Daniel had canceled dinner with her college roommate at the last minute because he didn't see the point of spending an evening with people who weren't going anywhere in life. Emily had laughed it off on the phone, calling it a joke that came out wrong. But Walter noticed she didn't sound like she believed that herself. He almost said something that night. He almost told her about the cold feeling that had settled in his chest since the day he shook Daniel's hand in the garage. But he stopped himself because he remembered his own father once telling him that the fastest way to push your child away is to tell them the person they love isn't good enough, especially when you can't fully explain why. So instead, he just listened. He told her that real love makes room for the people who matter to you, not less room. And then he changed the subject, because that's what a father does when he's trying to protect his daughter's happiness, even while quietly worrying about her heart. He hung up the phone that night and sat alone in his kitchen for a long time, staring at a photograph of his late wife on the counter, wondering what she would have said, wondering if he was doing this whole thing right. He never got an answer. He just kept working, kept saving, kept showing up. If you've ever watched someone you love walk towards something that worries you, and you've had to decide whether to speak up or trust them to find their own way through it, you already know exactly how Walter felt during those 2 years. And if a story like this, the kind where love gets tested by pride, and where the people who look poorest on paper often turn out to be the richest in the ways that matter, means something to you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what happens next in that church is something you are not going to want to miss. The morning of the wedding, Walter woke up at 5, the way he always did. Old habits from 30 years of opening the shop early. He tried on the suit he'd bought for the occasion. It was the nicest thing he owned. A navy blazer he'd saved for over 4 months, paired with dress pants he'd had tailored at the shop 3 blocks over. He was proud of that suit. At 7 that morning, one of his regular customers called in a panic. Her car had broken down on the highway with her 2 kids in the back seat, both of them late for a flight to see their grandmother, who was in the hospital and might not make it through the week. Walter looked at the clock. He looked at his suit hanging on the closet door. And he made a decision that, in hindsight, would end up defining everything that came after. He put his work clothes back on, drove out to the highway, and spent 2 hours under that woman's car in the summer heat, getting her back on the road in time to make the flight. He didn't tell her who he was beyond his first name. He didn't ask for money. He just fixed the car because that's what you do when somebody needs help and you're the only one who can give it. By the time he got home, he had 40 minutes to shower, and even after scrubbing until his knuckles were raw, the grease had worked its way so deep into the creases of his hands and the fabric of his good shirt that no amount of soap was going to fully erase it. He didn't have time to find a replacement blazer. His only choice was an older jacket from his closet, the same one he wore most days at the shop, stained and worn but clean enough for church if you didn't look too closely. He put it on, looked in the mirror, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He knew how this would look. He almost called Emily to explain. But her phone was already off. She was getting her hair and makeup done, surrounded by bridesmaids, having the one morning of pure joy every bride deserves. He wasn't going to interrupt that with his own worry. So he told himself it would be fine. Nobody would even notice a jacket in a church full of expensive dresses and rented tuxedos. He was wrong. The wedding started beautifully. The church was full of white flowers and afternoon light pouring through stained glass windows that threw color across the pews. Emily looked like something out of a painting. Her father's arm looped through hers as they walked down the aisle together, her eyes wet with happy tears the whole way. Walter placed her hand in Daniel's, the way tradition asked him to, and stepped back to take his seat in the front row. That's when Daniel's eyes moved over him, slowly, taking in the stains, the wrinkled collar, the hands that no soap in the world could fully clean. And in front of the priest, in front of 300 guests, in front of his own bride, Daniel said it. You couldn't even rent a suit for your own daughter's wedding? The words landed like a slap across a silent room. A few people gasped. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. Emily's face went white, her mouth opening to say something, but no sound came out at first, like the shock had stolen her voice completely. Walter stood there, absorbing it the way he'd absorbed hard things his whole life. Quietly, without complaint, because that's who he was. But this time, something different happened. The priest, an older man named Father Michael who had known Walter for almost 20 years, who had baptized Emily as a baby and watched Walter raise her alone, through every hard season a single father faces, stepped forward. And he raised both hands, not in blessing, but in a way that clearly meant stop. We are pausing this ceremony, Father Michael said, his voice calm but absolutely unshakable, until I understand what I just heard. The church went completely silent. Daniel blinked, caught off guard, clearly not expecting anyone to challenge him, least of all a priest in the middle of his own wedding. Father, I just meant. I know exactly what you meant, Father Michael said. And before this ceremony continues, everyone in this room is going to understand who this man actually is. If you think that's the end of the confrontation, it's not even close. Because what Father Michael said next is the moment that changed everything. But we need one more piece of the story first, because the biggest twist hasn't happened yet. Father Michael turned to face the congregation, his eyes moving slowly across the packed pews. 15 years ago, he said, this church had a roof that was collapsing. We had raised barely half the money we needed for repairs, and winter was 3 weeks away. I remember standing in this exact spot, wondering how we were going to keep our doors open. He paused, looking directly at Walter, a mechanic from 3 blocks away, a man who had just lost his wife and was raising a 9-year-old daughter completely alone, walked into my office and handed me an envelope. Inside was every dollar he had saved toward his daughter's college fund. He told me the church needed it more than he needed a guarantee. He told me he'd find another way for his daughter's future. He asked me never to tell anyone, especially not her. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. She had never heard this story. Not once, in all her years growing up in that garage, had her father ever mentioned it. I kept that promise for 15 years, Father Michael continued, but I think today is the day it needs to be told. He looked at Daniel now, his expression steady but firm. This man rebuilt his daughter's college fund one oil change at a time, working 6 days a week for years, because he gave away what he'd saved without asking for anything back. He has fixed cars for single mothers at 3 in the morning without charging them. He sponsors 2 children through a mission program in Guatemala every single month without fail and has for over a decade. Ask anyone in this town what kind of man Walter is, and I promise you not one person will mention his jacket. The church was completely silent except for the sound of someone quietly crying in the 3rd row. Daniel's face had gone pale. I didn't know, he said, his voice smaller now than it had been minutes earlier. That's exactly the problem, Father Michael said. You didn't ask. You looked at a man's hands and decided you already knew everything about his worth. Emily stepped forward then, her wedding dress trailing across the stone floor, and took her father's stained hand in both of hers without any hesitation at all. These hands, she said, her voice breaking, built my entire life. Every single thing I have, every opportunity, every door that ever opened for me, came from these hands. She turned to Daniel, tears streaming freely now, ruining the makeup she'd spent 3 hours on that morning. You just told me, in front of everyone we know, exactly who you are. And I need you to understand that I heard it. The church stayed silent, 300 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next in a wedding that had stopped being a wedding and had become something else entirely. Daniel reached for her hand, panic creeping into his voice. Emily, please, I made a mistake. I was nervous, I didn't mean. You meant every word, she said quietly. You just didn't expect anyone to notice. She slipped the engagement ring from her finger, the diamond catching the colored light from the stained glass windows one last time, and placed it gently in his palm. I'm sorry, she said, and for the first time all day, her voice sounded completely steady. I can't marry someone who thinks my father's worth is measured by a jacket. She turned, took her father's arm the same way she had walking down the aisle less than an hour before, and together they walked back up that same aisle, except this time it wasn't a wedding processional. It was something braver. Nobody clapped. Nobody said a word. The only sound in that entire church was the soft rustle of a wedding dress and the quiet, steady footsteps of a father and daughter walking out together, exactly the way they had walked through everything else in their lives. Outside, in the sunlight, Emily finally let herself break down completely, sobbing into her father's grease-stained shoulder while he held her the way he had held her since she was 9 years old, without a single word of blame or regret. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." "You don't apologize for trusting somebody," Walter said softly. "You just learn, and you keep your heart open for the person who actually deserves it." The story could have ended there, and it would have already been enough. But 3 months later, something happened that nobody, not even Father Michael, could have predicted. Emily quit her marketing job. She said she needed something that felt honest again, something that reminded her of who she actually was before glass walls and expensive dinners convinced her that value could be measured in things you could see from the outside. She started helping her father at the shop, learning the business side, the parts he'd never had time to modernize because he was always too busy fixing cars for people who couldn't afford to wait. Within a year, she had built a small website for the shop, started a program offering free basic repairs 1 Saturday a month for single parents and elderly customers on fixed incomes, and quietly, without ever mentioning it publicly, began paying forward everything her father had spent a lifetime giving away. Word got around town. Not because anyone advertised it, but because that's what happens when kindness is real. People talk. People remember. People bring their friends. The shop that once barely broke even started thriving. Not because Walter changed who he was, but because the whole town had finally seen, in one unforgettable afternoon inside a church, exactly who he had been all along. In the weeks after the wedding that never finished, the story spread through the small town faster than Walter ever expected. People he'd never even met stopped by the shop just to shake his hand. A woman he'd helped years earlier, whose transmission he'd fixed for free the winter her husband was between jobs, came in with a casserole and tears in her eyes, telling him she'd always known there was something different about him. Daniel tried calling Emily a handful of times over the following month. He sent a long letter, handwritten, apologizing and asking for another chance. Emily read it once, sitting on the front steps of her father's shop with the evening sun going down behind the tree line, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of spite, but because some doors are meant to close gently instead of slamming shut. She didn't hate him. She simply understood, with a clarity she hadn't had before that day in the church, that respect isn't something you can apologize your way back into once you've shown someone exactly how little you thought of them in front of everyone who mattered. 2 years after that wedding day, Emily married someone else. A quiet man named Marcus who taught high school science and drove a car 12 years old, the same age as some of the students he taught. He proposed to her in the garage, down on one knee on the same concrete floor stained with decades of oil, because that was the place that actually meant something to both of them. At their wedding, Walter walked her down the aisle again, wearing the same navy blazer he'd bought years earlier, the one he'd been too embarrassed to wear the first time because a stranger's emergency had mattered more to him than his own appearance. When it came time for him to speak, he stood at the front of a much smaller church, surrounded by people who actually knew him, and said only one thing. "I've spent my whole life believing that what you do with your hands matters more than what you wear on your back. I'm just glad my daughter finally married someone who believes the same thing." The room laughed softly, and then it grew quiet, and then, one by one, people started to clap, not for the wedding, but for the man standing there in a jacket that had once been mocked in a church 3 years earlier, now standing proud in front of everyone who genuinely loved him. Some people spend their entire lives trying to prove their worth to people who were never going to see it, no matter what they wore or how hard they worked or how much they gave away in silence. And some people, if they're lucky, find out that the ones who truly matter were watching all along. If this story reminded you that real worth was never about appearances, and that kindness given quietly always finds its way back around eventually, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe if you believe stories like this still matter, and I'll see you in the next one.